All right. Well, today we have a speaker with us, Derek. He is a member of the SHoWLE board, and he is a librarian by trade at the University of Toledo. And he has a lot of good information about immigration. It's something that he's been studying up on for a long time, and so he agreed to present this presentation for us. And let's welcome Derek.
And I hope everyone's doing all right. So actually, this is actually more of an area of passion for me. Like all of us, I think we all have a desire to know what our past is, who our ancestors were and such. And how many people have gone to Ancestry.com or some related area and looked up they're trying to find out what their relatives are like, who their ancestors were, only to find that we all, to some degree, one way or another, many of us, I should say all of us, but many of us have are descended from immigrants of one sort or another that have come to this country from the early days, whether it was the Mayflower or those that came with from Spain or other areas from all points in between. So, anyways, so this is more of a passion of mine and a desire to actually learn more about my own personal history. As you can see down below, it says R. Derek Wilmot Montoya. My mother's maiden name is Montoya. My grandmother, her mother, became a naturalized citizen back in the 70s and I got to see her going through that process. My grandfather, her husband, was born on the United States side. Now down in New Mexico is where I grew up. That is an area that was part of the Gadsden Purchase. So after the Mexican-American War, when the United States won all this territory and concessions from Mexico and came many people that were in the Southwest, including my grandfather's family and parent, excuse me, his ancestors, they like to say, and like many of us down in the Southwest say, that the border crossed them. They didn't cross the border because they became American citizens after the Mexican-American War ended and the territory, and they became territories. So with that, I'm going to go on. A few other things that I'd like to mention is that because of being my passion, I'm also with the American Library Associations. I joined up and became part of their social responsibility roundtable, and I serve as an officer on there, and I'm also part of one of the subcommittee called Services to Refugees, Immigrants, and Displaced Persons, which is part of that reports to the Office of Diversity, Literacy, and Outreach Services, and it's their advisory committee. That's part of the ALA, and so they look and trying to work with these communities that are here, that are new, that are coming to the United States. New Americans is what they often call it. So with that, we'll go with this presentation here. And one last thing, Lamp by the Golden Door. I wanted to mention what that was about. So there's an inscription, and we'll talk about it a little bit more later on, at the base of the Statue of Liberty. And it mentions the lamp by the golden door, which is like a beacon to all immigrants and people that are seeking refuge and asylum. And that's why I chose that as the topic of this title, or the title of this title. And so what we're going to do is we're going to cover these areas and slide areas here. And I need to round a lot, so I apologize to Doug, who's trying to capture this. And we're going to talk about why people immigrate, the history of it. Mainly, we're going to talk about the history of immigration and how it's intertwined with how we view things for the period of time that we have today when it comes to immigration myths, the debates that are going on, and how it impacts us as secular humanists. Because I really want to tie that in as part of who we are as an organization. Well, it's not. I like to put that disclaimer out, is just because I have an L for my profession for lawyer is not. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a librarian. So there's a little bit of a difference there. I know it starts out the same. So this is not. I'm not going to be able to provide any kind of legal advice, or this is solely from my viewpoint, not that of my institution. It's my own passion. My actual work is with acquisitions and collection management, and so that doesn't really have anything to do with this particular topic. So this kind of speaks about the various reasons as to why people immigrate to places like the United States or other countries. There's a variety of reasons. From our earliest days, with the Huguenots, for example, that were in that immigrated from France, being persecuted by religious persecution. They came to Charleston, South Carolina, back in the late 1700s, to people that are needing brother, whether they're real or perceived. They come seeking asylum in other countries. And in the action, there's a lot of examples that could be spoken about even today. So we have people from Ukraine, from Haiti, that are all over here in the United States right now that have been seeking refuge and given a temporary, recently under the Biden administration, many of them have been given temporary protected status for at least another 18 months as of yesterday. So to bring it more into reality, why are Ukrainians seeking refuge over here? Because there's a war in their country and it's driving them out, and that they're just they're just one example of a long history of people that have sought asylum in another country, and sometimes it's not always for perceived persecution or anything like that. It's just for economic reasons. So people migrating up from Central or South America to the United States or in other areas, even here in the United States, I myself can be considered a migrant because I moved from South Carolina a few years ago, seeking better opportunity, economic opportunities here in Toledo, Ohio. So that's an internal type of migration. So with that, and I kind of alluded to that just now, is a definition. Definitions are actually very important. I think having an idea of what these words represent whenever you hear them in social media, on the news, it's really important to know what those words really mean. So I'll start with migrant. It's basically anyone who is moving from one geographic location to another. So that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be permanent there. That's why you have people that are migrant workers that are moving from one agricultural area to another, picking our strawberries up and apples in Michigan to working out in great pulling or working in the vineyards out in California and such, and everything in between. Even down in South Carolina, they're an agricultural state, just like Ohio is. So that's just one form of examples of that definition there. Refugees is actually a legal status that was first established in 1951 under a very young United Nations at that time. In 1951, they had the Refugee Convention, which during that time, right at the end of World War II, there were a lot of people that were forced out, displaced because of the Second World War. And so this kind of gave the first steps of that process, what a refugee was and how nations were supposed to accommodate and recognize people who were being displaced for definitely for religious persecution in the case of the Jewish people that were escaping from what was Nazi persecution in the 1940s and 30s and 40s there. But this codified that. The United States was not a signatory to it because we felt at that time it wasn't strong enough. This was under Eisenhower when he was president. But by 1967 protocol, which expanded it and made it a stronger document for those base rights for the Refugee Convention, we signed on to it at that point. That included places out in Asia and such. And it was during the Cold War that I think this is really where it established a lot of that. Asylum seekers are basically people who have not been given that refugee status yet. So you hear a lot of people that are talking about in the media of people coming to the southern border primarily because it's so much. It's an easy access to the United States, but that's not the only place. People come to our ports, like in Los Angeles or Miami or New York, even, and they seek asylum in a variety of different ways. They even come in from Canada at times, and seek asylum here. Actually, some famous or infamous is Ted Cruz's family. Senator Cruz, his family came in through Canada from Cuba. They were escaping the Cuban regime at that time under Fidel Castro, and then later on immigrated to the United States. So technically, they were asylum seekers that were given refugee status, and eventually they became U.S. citizens. And Ted Cruz himself became United States senator. And then, for better or worse, hey, Immigrants are people that are permanently residing in their in the country of origin, or not country of origin, in the country that they're seeking refuge in, or seeking some kind of economic status that they're trying to remain in that country or continue definitely, essentially. So, and please, if you have any questions while I'm going through this, let me know.
So an immigrant is not a citizen yet.
No, actually,
Permanently, yeah.
right. You can actually be a resident. So, if you move to another country, that's why we have expats in other countries right now that are living in France or England and places like that for economic reasons. They'll stay there, or they'll come here to the United States and work for our companies and stay here the entire time, and never become a U.S. citizen. And that's because they go through the process of the legal process of updating their visas to stay in this country under whatever work permits that they're allocated or given that form. So interesting enough, as I was driving down to pick up my son yesterday, I was listening to a podcast by NPR Throughline, and I told Heather about this last night. I said, they stole my part of my presentation because on Throughline, it's an NPR thing that talked about like the early histories of asylum seekers, what this particular episode was about. And I wanted to bring out and talk about the Statue of Liberty just for a little bit, because at the base, there's an inscription that is that was assigned to it about her being the mother of exiles, and that on the right you'll see it says, "Keep ancient land, your storing pomp, crush you with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, and your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless tempest tossed, to me. I lift my lap outside the golden door." We have created and in some cases, I guess you could say, a myth about our own nation, saying that we are a beacon. It's an idealized vision of ourselves, that we are promoting democracy and freedom around the world. And part of it is the Statue of Liberty, which was built in 1868 or finished in 1868. It was a French architect who came up with the design in the 1860s, in about 1865, and he was very pro-union and so excited about this young United States that was advocating for freedoms and breaking the shackles of slavery in this country. And so, because of that, he came up with this design that is actually a combination of two different Roman gods or goddesses, actually, the sun god Invictus, Sol Invictus, and the one Libertas, which was another one that in Roman times that slaves would actually venerate in the hopes of being free. And so that actually represents a lot of the ideals of the United States as a nation. And we want to be this shining beacon on the hill. When we say that throughout our history, we've talked about that from the early days of the Republic, when we wrote the Declaration of Independence of all people should be free. And yet at the same time, we also had this bipolar type situation going on, because we still, at that point, early in our history, had people that were enslaved, working in as indentured servants in this country, and that we wouldn't recognize them as full citizens of this great nation.
Did you know that there's a smaller version of the Statue of Liberty in Paris?
I sort of did, sort of not. But yeah, no.
And the internal structure of the one here in the U.S. was built by Gustav Eiffel.
All right. I did read about that. Yeah, that's fascinating. Yes, sir.
The other thing that always impresses me, it's this mighty woman,
right?
For back in 1860 with the mild eyes, and then where the status of women was at that time. It's just amazing.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's because we had, there was a lot of misogyny that was still happening around that time as well. So it's amazing that we actually have a woman that represents to represent liberty in this country. So I'm going to go back to the very early days when George Washington was here. when he was president, the very first thing that they did was Congress passed and a young and a in our young nation here, and George Washington signed into it was the Naturalization Act of 1790, which was later strengthened in 1802. And what I wanted to point out about that was that it established the first rules of United States citizenship. This law required that all white persons of good character to live in the United States for 2 years and their state for 1 before applying for citizenship. It was meant, this is where I say that we're a bit bipolar. It was also meant to exclude others. In particular, it excluded people that are indigenous Americans, indentured slaves, servants, slaves, free black people, free blacks, and later Asians. And that was established early in the bones of our structure of our country and our foundation, essentially, that we wanted to exclude people and say, we are representing only white persons at this point.
White men.
And white men. But that was more for
And
property owners at that point, too. Exactly. Yeah. And by 1868, we had the 14th Amendment was finally established. And this is kind of pivotal because this sets birthright citizenship for this country. And this is something that a lot that's being trying to be discredited in today's politics and such, because the people that are opposing it do not want anyone that's born on U.S. soil to become an American citizen automatically, because they want to go back to the 1790 law, essentially, in so many ways. And the reason why that 1868 law, the 14th Amendment was passed in 1868 was because it was at the end of after the Civil War ended. And you had all these people that were no longer enslaved, that were that had been on plantations and other places and farms and such. What were you going to do with this large population? In the early 1790s and such, the U.S. Constitution was officially ratified and such. African Americans at that time, primarily those that were enslaved, were 3/5 of a person for the census, but they weren't U.S. citizens. So there was this is just, it's kind of mind-boggling in some ways as to how we approach this over time. But as it says there, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. And from there on, that's actually been true to today. Yes.
For about 10 years, I had college students living with me, so I could move around. And one of the fellows from Philly College was married, and she had a baby in Philly Hospital, and her baby was instantly an American.
Right.
And when he turns 18, he will be able to go back and forth. They're from Saudi Arabia.
See, some of them also have dual citizenship at that point.
And the father is waiting for him to turn 18. So his father can come over here.
And his father. Yeah, that's interesting because depending on where you are and what country you come from, there is the line can be actually longer or shorter. So, and I'm kind of getting ahead of myself a little bit, but and that's why some opponents of the way of our immigration system is actually set up right now says that it's still unfair and that it needs to be reevaluated and fixed, essentially, because you might come from a country like Saudi Arabia and get fast tracked. You might come from South Africa and be the son of a benefited from an emerald mine from someone, and then let your visa lapse and such as a student and still become an American citizen. So,
or Jewish. For a long time, Jewish people weren't allowed in.
So, right. And actually, that's actually another one of those areas that we didn't want to allow certain people in, certain groups, whether it was ethnicity or whether it was based on their religious beliefs, or even their political viewpoints or their gender identity or sexual preferences. By 1882, we had another major law that came into effect, which was the Chinese Exclusion Act of that year. And it was meant specifically to stop people from China were immigrating to the United States anymore. Now, prior to that, in the 1840s, 1848, there at Sutter Mill was when gold had been discovered. And with that, there was such a need for people to come over and immigrate to the United States to work in our fields, work in our mines, mainly to work on railroads, because we were starting to build up this country and set this infrastructure. We didn't have any kind of highways or anything like that, because that was way before cars. So that would work more with younger people. But anyways, but rail lines was a way to travel, and it was also establishing that partial myth of manifest destiny, where it was a divine right that we actually have from sea to shining sea, the United States under one specific group of people at that point still. And that was before the Civil War. So we were welcoming people from China. And then by 1882, there was a backlash against it and said, we do not want these people over here. And so at that particular act came into being so that they end up coming over. And to talk about the different, if you want to, since we were talking about earlier about reading books and such, and the upcoming book club that we have, I have 3 that you can actually select from. Chinese Massacre of Rock Springs, Wyoming, in September 2nd, 1885. Kind of gives you a little bit of the vibe and feel that was going on at the time. And Massacre for Gold, the Chinese in Hell's Canyon, which took place in, I think it was 1888. But China has a great book on the Chinese Exclusion Act, was written by John Sonisha. And it's called Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. So I highly recommend those particular works. For want of time, I'm kind of showing some acts and provisions so that you can read them. But I'm not going to actually read every one of these things to go into them. In particular, I just want to highlight the issues as I come across them. So kind of forwarding up to now to the early 20th century. I mean, we're just leaving the 19th century behind. And with it, we come up with 1907. So this is where I was talking about. It wasn't necessarily people of an ethnic group, but the Immigration Act of 1907 restricted people with medical conditions. So if you were diagnosed with schizophrenia, for example, you weren't allowed to promote here. And they were also excluding people that were anarchists at that point too. Oddly enough, or interesting enough. Polygamists were not allowed to come over to the United States. Unaccompanied children at that point. You have that whole debate going on right now about separation of families and stuff. It has its roots in 1907. And later on, of course, those things change.
So kids they could come over with their parents though. But right. They were trying to escape, even like a 16-year-old trying to get across the and say,
pretty much. Yep. Yeah. So, so if you were an unaccompanied minor, if you were not with your parents or another family member, you couldn't come into the United States in 1907. Yes.
Yeah. Just the other day, I saw a video. They were doing a New York City tour and they do highlight stuff, and they were on Ellis Island, and they had a puzzle that they had to solve. They had to solve a puzzle to make sure that they weren't feeble-minded.
Exactly. And that was part of that process there from that immigration act. And then forward a little bit up to 1921, and you have the Emergency Quota Act. Now, this was really a defining moment, 21 and 24, because that Johnson Reed Act in 24 strengthened that emergency quota. It set a standard of 3% for whatever population that was already here in the United States of that ethnic group, and it limited those from other countries. So if you had a large population of German immigrants, which we had at that time, and from England because of our early history, then you were there. It was an easier process for a nation with some of those people that were immigrating from those countries to come over to the United States. But it was meant to exclude people from like Southeastern Europe and Southern Europe there primarily. So Hungarians, Italians, who wanted to limit numbers but up to that point, they had been coming in droves. And the highest numbers of immigration that ever took place in this country was in the early 1900s. And a little fun fact, libraries were very much supportive and starting to build up the early foundations for providing support to immigrant populations through reading programs, through teaching them English second language type programs so that they can learn English and learn more about the culture of the United States as an assimilated country over time. And I thought I saw a hand going up for a second. Okay. So anyways, so that was a very pivotal moment, like I said, 21 through 24. But another little interesting factoid is those Johnson Reed Act, for example, there was no quota on countries from Latin America or Central America, or from South America, Central America. So at that point, they were still able to freely come back and forth between the United States and Mexico and countries further south. On that was, but by 1929, and between 1929, which was the Great Depression, was impacting the United States at that point. We several cities and states decided that they needed to make space for so many people, so many workers that were with losing their farms and things like that. That we needed to remove anyone that was Mexican or Mexican American here in the United States and deport them to Mexico. And it's estimated, as I have on the notes here, that that between 200,000 and 2 million people that happened to look brown, because there wasn't always people that were Mexican and Mexican American, were forced by cities and states, and with the help of private organizations, to deport it to Mexico. Arguably, this needs the definition of ethnic cleansing. And about 60% of them were birthright U.S. citizens. So the 14th Amendment didn't apply to them all of a sudden. The United States government under Franklin Delano Roosevelt turned a blind eye to it and just ignored it. So people were being shipped out of places like Detroit, and there was about 12. I read an article not too long ago where about 1,200 people that were in Detroit of Mexican or appeared to be Mexican descent were shipped from there at that time. So 29 to 36. And if you think like the Grapes of Wrath, you had people that were losing their farms in places like Oklahoma because of the Dust Bowl and environmental conditions. This is what we were talking about that second or third slide there, that people were migrating from one part of the United States to other parts. And reality was it really hurt our economy and didn't prepare us, partly didn't want to prepare us for the Second World War. Because by 1942, we started, World War II happened, and we suddenly had a dearth in workers. We needed people that were helping in the war industry to fight against the Germans, and the Nazis in Europe, and against the Axis power and the Japanese over in the Pacific. And we just didn't have enough people. So FDR made an agreement with the Mexican government called the Bracero Program. From 1942 to 64, we were bringing people back to the United States. And here's that bipolar type thing going on again. On one hand, we're pushing them back. On the other, we're bringing them back and welcoming them back. And on a personal note, I had a great uncle who was a beneficiary of the Bracero Program. He came over. He recently passed away a few years ago, and came over and worked in the agricultural areas down in the ranches and such down in southern New Mexico. And eventually he became a U.S. citizen, family that worked his way through and gave a pathway to U.S. citizenship over time. Yes.
Well, how do they know that they had been sent back to Mexico and then come back to work in the United States?
So that's two different things that were happening. And this is historians, and they're looking at a lot of the early records and things like that. So there's a lot of documentation taking place in newspapers at the time. So they were reviewing primary sources, people that were and U.S. actually had U.S. citizenship, had their birth certificates and such. And so they're able to examine those types of documents. And so that's an estimation of about 60% of them that were U.S. citizens by birthright citizenship here in this country.
Did they advertise at the time? We need workers.
Oh, the Bracero Program?
Yeah,
Yeah, that's exactly right. So when they started opening up and inviting people coming back over, it was mainly through employers. So we had employers that these ranch owners and the early stages of the agribusiness that started to take place would go down, and they still do it today. They will go down to places like Mexico and other countries and invite them and say, and today it's the H1, it's the EB1 visas and the EB5, and some of us are more familiar with the HB1 visas, but it really is. It's just recruiters going out there and inviting people to come over to the United States for work. And that still continues on to this day. So the Persona program was formed in 42 to 64, but here's a little funny thing that ends up happening in the next slide. So this was kind of a history, and I apologize. There is a lot on there. From 48 to 53, we invited the Displaced Persons Act of 1948, followed by 1953 by the Refugee Relief Act, which essentially invited over 400,000 people from Europe to the United States. In 48, it was people that had been persecuted by the Nazis and were fleeing that. And by 53, it was the Iron Curtain going up that Prime Minister Winston Churchill had made famous when he said that there was an Iron Curtain going up in Europe, and he was talking about that. And there was about 210,000 people that were displaced from places like Hungary, the former Czechoslovakia, which is now Czech Republic or Czechia, Poland, East Germany, and places like that. We invited them to come here to escape those the communist nations at that point. But by 1954, there had been such an abuse of the Bracero program by employers that we have something that was brought up by candidate for President Trump during his candidacy for a second term here, and is now as incoming president Fox had talked about Operation Wetback. Now, wetback is a slur actually, and very derogatory. But there was a mass deportation that took place because the employers were that were running these a lot of these operations were it was sharecroppers and others that were just that were being impacted by it. Sharecroppers and growers along the U.S. border had created a widespread corruption, and so the American public became angry, and we conducted some more mass deportations of up to about 1.1 million Mexican nationals at that point. And again, you can bet that there wasn't just Mexican nationals that they were deporting. There's a great book that I don't have listed here, and I wish I had, called Border Patrol USA, and it came out in 2012, and it talks about an American citizen who was down in North Carolina. Guys like his last name was Smith or something like that. He had some mental issues. Didn't have his any kind of paperwork on, where he didn't have his driver's license or anything like that. He was deported to Mexico, even though he was a U.S. citizen, did speak Spanish, just a brown skin looking dude. And they shipped him there in 2010. And this is on, and he eventually wound up 3 years later making his way down to some place like Honduras or someplace and to a U.S. embassy. And they said, "What?" In the U.S. embassy, the members were going, "You're a U.S. citizen. What are you doing down here?" And he's like, "I got deported." Even though I told them that I was a U.S. citizen, they wouldn't believe me, and they deported me. So things like that still happen to this day. And so thinking about that, this is something that when we're thinking about mass deportations, which is what this current incoming president has been talking about, it's going to have major impact on all levels. The 1965 Hart-Celler Act changed immigration policy under Lyndon B. Johnson. It abolished quotas. So that earlier one from 1921 to 24, it abolished those, but created a preference system with 75% family reunification, 20% employment, and 5% as refugees. Those were the preferences being set at that time. It's also removed de facto discrimination against Southern and Eastern Europeans at that time too. That was in 65. Asians and other non-Western, Northern European ethnicities, it also removed that discrimination against them because those earlier laws had been set up to discriminate specifically against all these people here. Now, another major act came in 1980. Who was, right before. So this was Jimmy Carter, and who's sadly been in the news, who just recently passed away. Under his administration, now this is a wonderful thing that he had done. His administration had done. They had signed into law under President Carter, defined the status in the United States, defined refugee status in the United States. So he finally gave a definition of what refugee status was here in our own country. And signed UN, the 1967 protocol was, but they hadn't really codified that until 1980. It increased refugee admissions to 50,000 people per year, created the Office of Refugee Settlement, provides funding for resettlement programs and funding to state and local agencies, established a process for adjusting admissions during emergencies. So if you needed to increase the number of visas for those that were seeking temporary protected status, like Haiti when they had their earthquake, then they could do that. They can adjust it as needed. It wasn't static and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, you've hit your quota." And that's partly because what happened in World War II when we had refugees that were coming from from trying to escape Nazi Germany during the war and before the war, and we turned them away because they didn't meet the criteria of being able to come to the country at that time. And some of them were sent back and into the concentration camps being killed. So this changed that process by 1980. And it also established a program for refugee integration in the United States. For that, it was basically kind of set up by the counties, the cities, the states themselves to kind of negotiate how they would do that. So it provided for job training, English as a second language programs, and social services for these new immigrant communities that were coming here, asylum seekers that were seeking refugee status in the United States. And libraries like ours here in Sanger and others, they have programs to this day based off of that still teach people how to what the process is for citizenship. Citizenship for they have classes that teach English for new Americans or new arrivals here. And then by 86, you had another change that took place, and this one's what more became more restrictive again under Reagan. But at the same time, it's this bipolar thing going on. So the 1986 IRCA required employers to attest their workers of immigration status. And we remember about I-9 still around. Yeah. So that was established at that point for employers to make it that made it illegal to recruit and hire undocumented workers. So that was established at that point. Makes good sense. And it was supposed to really be impacting the employers, but right now it's being more as a use against the employees. It's a harder. So we can talk about that in more of a Q&A type session afterwards if we want to. But the one important thing I wanted to point out here was that in that same year, if you came here before 1982, Ronald Reagan provided amnesty of 4 million undocumented immigrants in this country at that point. 4 million. And that is a huge number of people that suddenly found themselves with the ability to go in and see either permanent residency here, do a legal process, or even U.S. A process for becoming U.S. citizens. That's something that hasn't happened since. Congress at the time passed that. Ronald Reagan signed it, signed that law into effect here. And this followed the original provisions of 1929 Registry Act, is what I listed. It has been enacted 4 times until 1986. Since then, the restrictions have been tighter and tighter and tighter, so that there's only maybe like 100 people or so that are getting that kind of opportunity. And then in 1990, you have the increased immigration to 675,000 people per year. Family-based immigrations has 5 distinct employment visas were established. Diversity visa, which you've heard about, may have heard about in the news as well, which is called the Green Card Lottery, which is run by the State Department, through the State Department, which allows about 55,000 people to be selected based on a 5-year review of countries with low numbers of immigrants coming into the United States. And here, we removed the English testing for U.S. citizenship. For coming over to the United States, not just for citizenship, that's actually still required, but for naturalization process and all that. And then the ban on homosexuals took place in 1990 as well. Yeah, which up to that point had still been in existence. So visa allegations, this is different from asylum seeking. So there's a small percentage of that is given out, 10% of visa allocations that are given out every year. But as you can see, almost 70% is family based. So if somebody was already here, that's a family member, and they wanted to come over here for either temporarily or permanently, then they could seek as an opportunity. And believe it or not, Melania Trump's family essentially used that to come over to the United States. And eventually they were fast tracked because of their son-in-law to become U.S. citizens and get U.S. citizenship. Melania Trump herself was a beneficiary of the employment-based visa, as well as Elon Musk that I kind of referenced earlier. They initially received those visas. Actually, I think I take that back. Elon Musk initially received a visa as a student visa, which is part of the 3% here. So yep.
No, that was my question. It's for those coming over with student visas. Where is that?
Yep, that's over that 3%. I'm not older. Now, one of the interesting things to note is that the most people that come into this country illegally are. So before that, it was basically the slap on the wrist, you get deported. Now we're starting to criminalize it, and that was started under your President Clinton. So it's there. Neither party has been very overall beneficial to the immigrant populations or the refugees that are seeking asylum in this country. And so it's to be honest. So under him and under primarily, I think at that time it was a hostile Republican Congress, they hammered this out and made this agreement. And it granted the Attorney General to build physical barriers between the United States and Mexico at that point. And then by 1998, we opened up the doors a little bit for Nicaraguans, Cubans, Salvadorans, Guatemalans that were escaping from former Soviet bloc countries and were allowed to be registered as asylum seekers here. And that opened up legal permanent residence for 186,000 people once that Nicaraguan adjustment, Central America relief act. And then in 2002, Title IV Director of Border and Transportation Security established to regulate what comes in and out of the United States at that. So you were stopping them at sea and at the border in an effort to prevent what happened terrorism. Because at that time, 2001 was still fresh in everybody's mind, having reorganized a lot of our federal government agencies under one, and it became Department of Homeland Security. And during that time, there was also this misperception that terrorists were coming into our southern border. But the reality is that the people that attacked us on September 11, 2001, they came over under student visas, and they came in legally. 4 of them came in from Canada, and the remainder came in flew in through LAX and Miami, and came in and under pilot licenses and such, and committed the atrocities that they did. And the response is that we vilified the people coming through the southern border because it was an easy target, essentially. Yes.
They came out legally.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And yet we don't have there's not a huge outcry to say build that wall on the Canadian border to suck in that. Even before terrorists, before the would-be terrorists, can do that part of the country. So it really, and it would also establish E-Verify in 2005. We set up our wonderful little, Real ID acronym. So your driver's licenses and your state IDs and such, that's where that came from. And then by 2012, Congress became deadlocked and really couldn't make any kind of impact on immigration policies or laws from there on out. So what ended up happening is President at that time, Obama had was trying to live up to a campaign promise that he had made to a lot of the immigrant communities here in the United States, and so he issued an executive order, presidential executive order, which is essentially it was a band-aid to the immigrant community at that time. There were about 800,000 people that were brought over the years as children over many, many years. And so in 2012, the Deferred Action for Early Childhood Arrival, or DACA, is what a lot of people hear in the media, sometimes known as the DREAM Act. That came into being at that point, but it had to be an executive order. And with executive orders, like I say, Congress wasn't able to act on any of this stuff because of a deadlock. As an executive order, that means later administrations can actually rescind it, do whatever they want to with it. And it has gone through the courts. Luckily, the Supreme Court has found that parts of DACA are still available. And these are people who were brought over as infants in some cases. And this is the only country they've ever known. So sending them back to their country of origin would be not just cruel. It would be highly. It would be an awful thing to be able to do to these folks, especially since they've established themselves within our communities long term as permanent residents. This is not, by the way, citizenship. They're still undocumented. And every 2 years, they have to reapply for DACA status. And there's fewer and fewer of them over time. There are so many restrictions on them. And some states like South Carolina, Alabama, Georgia will not allow them certifications in certain professions. So I had when I was at Clemson, South Carolina there, I had students that were at the university that were going through the nursing program. They couldn't be certified as nurses in the state, even though the state of South Carolina, for example, was in dire need of nurses. So they had to go to other places, other states, and hold weapons and allow them after they graduated.
And then they're certified from another state. Can they go back?
Nope, because they're still undocumented. They're still not. They couldn't work in South Carolina, for example.
Yeah, they couldn't. They
wouldn't stay over in New Mexico if they wanted to, because New Mexico or California or New York would actually honor allow them the opportunity to be certified.
But they couldn't go to where another state would.
Right, each state has their own certification process.
Yeah, the federal government has a rule that if your program gets federal dollars, you cannot employ undocumented workers.
There you go. So that's something else to take note of. So we're very bipolar with that process. But here on out, and if you have a misdemeanor, you're automatically, a serious misdemeanor, you can be sent away back to your country of origin. And there are people that have gone through this, served in the military, fought for our country in Afghanistan and Iraq, that because they got caught smoking pot, or had PTSD or something like that, and were self-medicating, they were shipped. Were shipped out to their country of origin, even though they've served this country and were honored and discharged. Usually, they're fast-tracked to become U.S. citizens at that point because they've served our country, led for our country in some cases, put their lives on the line, and yet they're kicked out the door. And there's some cases of that are taking place now. Now, from here on out, it's nothing but executive orders for the most part, until recently, actually, until this week, actually. But the immigration laws and policies have been set mainly through executive orders. You have the travel bans. There were 6 of them that specifically targeted people from Middle Eastern countries, and some African countries as well, and saying that we didn't want them here, or even so the Trump traveling is there. The family separations that had taken place under in 2018 under Attorney Jeff Sessions, where they were separating families that were seeking asylum in this country. These are asylum seekers. These are people coming up they have to, in order to become an asylum seeker in the country, you actually have to go up to an official. So a border patrol lady, you can go up and say, I'm seeking asylum in your country. Think of during the Cold War itself, it was not unheard of for like Olympians from Russia, from Soviet Union coming over into the United States or something, and then just finding an official and say, I'm seeking asylum. That's the same process. There are people that are seeking asylum from countries outside of the United States. Primarily, like I said, it's easier to go through the southern border to assign it to come up here because it's not as much of a natural barrier like it is with the oceans. They were seeking asylum, and many of them were being were being separated from the children at that point, or the other family members, because they might have been here with an older brother or another family member, not parents, because of escaping persecution in their countries, countries of origin in some cases. So during that time, by the time that Biden the administration came into effect, there were still, and then to just this year, actually, this past year, there's still 545 children that have not been reunited with their family members because of this policy. And they've been trying, but they can't find them. And when you bring a child over who's 2 or 3 years old and you ask them, what's your mom and dad's name? Well, mommy and daddy, right? So it's hard to identify based on not having that information, unless you have DNA evidence or some other way, some other form of being able to identify that child. So there are real life implications that are repercussions that can occur from some of the draconian measures that have taken place.
Now, where do those children go? Were they adopted or?
So, great question. And actually, some of them are in the foster care system, and have been adopted by other families and such. And then others are still languishing in deportation centers, which are basically glorified prisons. The prison industry runs a lot of these deportation centers, and some of it is in private industry. And a lot of right now are doing this because of the incoming president. And you have governors like in Texas, they're sitting there saying, we're going to build more deportation centers, more prisons, and that's going to make more money for this kind of industry. So, another one that I wanted to point out is Title 42, which has come up a lot and very recently. As of Heather Cox Richardson actually wrote about it in her latest post. And if she's a historian, and she writes these letters to America, which has been followed by millions actually in the United States. So she recently wrote about it, like last night, I think, talking about Title 42, which was established back in 1944. It's been rarely used, and the law empowers the federal health authorities to prohibit migrants from entering the country, prevent contagious diseases from spreading. Well, COVID-19 happened, and so we use that Title 42 to shut our borders down to asylum seekers coming to the United States at that time. And the Biden administration rescinded most of it, but there are still some of it in effect. And even now, as of this week, they're talking about looking for ways.
Stephen Miller.
Thank you. All I could think was Chris. Stephen Miller, who is a confidant of Donald Trump's, there is looking for ways to enact that to enhance it and make it even harder for people. The problem with that is it really builds on that stereotype of the dirty immigrant. And I remember listening to Pat Buchanan several years ago on some, like on CNN or something like that, talking about putting out misinformation about how Mexicans are coming over to the United States carrying leprosy. And so, and infecting people here in the United States. Well, if anybody knows anything about that particular disease, it takes years to be infected by someone and you'd have to live with it. Anyways, it's just nonsense. And it plays on those stereotypes, as well as even anti-Semitic to some degree, where you're looking at people based on their ethnicity or their religion or their.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing that the current thinking on the right has not advanced past the beginning of the 20th century with the eugenics movement and the feeble-mindedness and stuff. It's the same
It's the same mentality.
Same thing.
The same thoughts of saying, yeah, they keep pushing the same agenda on that. And that's been, so that kind of brings us up to today, pretty much. And some of the immigration debate that we're looking at is currently some of the misinformation that's out there. And I always like to point, like, I love this slide for various reasons. We have 335 million people living in the United States. Of that, 14% are immigrants. Now, that is everyone, every type of immigrant, whether they're documented or undocumented. That makes up, that's only 46 million out of that amount, 14%. That's a very small amount. Those that are undocumented, that focus laser-like attention to, are less than, it's 3.2% of the population. So 90, I mean, it's only, it's 11 million people. It has not changed in over 10 years, in that, people, of that number of people that are undocumented, or as some of law call illegal immigrants in the United States. And such a small percentage. Legal migration still is at about 1.2 million every year. And yet, we focus so much attention on such a small percentage. It's kind of like the transgender issue. You only have maybe 3 or 4 athletes out there that are in schools, or like a dozen or whatever it is, in the entire United States. And yet we're passing laws right and left on bathroom bills and things like this because we're afraid of just about maybe a dozen people. So we spend so much time and energy on things that don't. Here's a problem, and we try to make it. It's more based on our own biases and prejudices as a society. And until we can kind of get past that, we're gonna still remain in that kind of mindset. Talking about the early 20th century there with those eugenics movements and things like that, where they were looking at the size of the brain or the skull, and trying to indicate when somebody was of a subspecies and things like that. That's all playing on that same fear and prejudices. A Gallup poll found in the United States that 68% of Americans think immigration is a good thing for the United States. Almost 70% of the country still thinks that immigration, because many of us, I would bet everybody in this room is descended from an immigrant family or ancestors. I know I am. Come up on one side of the pyramid, and the other side not. So at University American poll, I saw most Americans prefer a path to citizenship. 58%. And it breaks down even along party lines. 45% of the Republicans are in agreement that there should be a path to citizenship, while 75% of Democrats do as well. And mass deportations, most people are against that kind of thing because it's going to cost so much. 26% of people, and what not just cost is in money, but in what the impact is on communities at large. So 26% of people overall that were polled indicated that they're not in favor of that, and 40% of them are Republican, are in favor of it. 26% are in favor, according to that poll. 40% are Republican. It breaks down again along party lines. 14% Democrat. Under Donald Trump's first administration, he kept talking about building a wall. Well, only about 50 miles are actually built. 450 miles of that wall that they claimed was already there. They just kind of strengthened up what was already in existence, and then claimed victory at 500 miles of wall. And 50 of it was actually constructed, brand new construction. And it's a 2,000-mile order that we're looking at. This is a tiny little percentage, but perceptions matter more to this administration, this incoming administration, than reality. And that's what gets harped on quite considerably. Most of what's going to happen on these mass deportations and things like that, and this happened under the previous administration with Donald Trump's first administration, was it's going to be a lot more internal displacement, a lot more internal focus and enforcement. And it was just a couple of days ago that I read that 2 police officers in Cleveland that were off-duty cops at a bar attacked and detained a person, an African-American person, because they thought he was an illegal immigrant. And they contacted law enforcement. Now they're being investigated. The 2 officers are. Potentially they could be losing their jobs over the fact that they attacked some guy who was a U.S. citizen.
I remember during Trump's first administration, the Border Patrol used to stop buses on the turnpike
Yeah,
and check papers
they still do that.
because we are within the border jurisdiction area.
Right, within 40 miles of the United States, and Toledo is right up against, buttressed against Canada, and that includes our waterways as well. So and it's not just going north and south, but it's east and west as well. As when my ex-wife and I, when we were traveling in New Mexico, this is more of a personally, I was visiting my grandmother who lives in a place called Columbus, New Mexico, 3 miles from the border on the U.S. side. We went there. She had not met our youngest grandchild yet at that point. I have 2 kids. And so she was, my daughter was just a few months old at that point. And so we went, visited, and we were driving, I was driving a rental minivan at that point, just because it was just easy to get around that way. And as we were coming up, there's a border checkpoint, 6 miles in. There's one right on the border, and then 6 miles in, there's another. So I never went into Mexico, never had any inclination to do it. So this is my family member. And so when I was stopped, I was asked to produce my children's birth certificates. And I'm like, why? I came from South Carolina. We came here to visit my grandmother who lives in Columbus, right on the border there. And they patrol all the way up to where I grew up in a place called Denver, New Mexico, 30 miles in. And so they were asked, and they were getting irate with me. I was getting irate with them because who travels with your children's birth certificates if you're not intending to leave behind, right?
Right.
So these are real life impacts that can factors, the situations that can and will occur and have occurred. Luckily, my mother was in the vehicle with us, and she worked at that time at social services, so she had traveled a lot between Deming and Columbus with clients and things like that. And she said, "Hey, John, it's me. These are my grandkids. Aren't they beautiful? Oh, Margaret, I didn't see you there. Sure, you guys can go on." But before that, he was getting ready to arrest me because I was being almost deliberate.
Trafficking children,
Yeah,
I guess, right?
because at one point I said, "Well, why don't you contact their hospital and get a birth certificate?" I don't even give you the phone number because I was just not in the right frame at 10 o'clock at night. So, anyways, so we're looking at again having a similar situation take place. We're talking about mass deportations, and this is interactive. So I'm just going to ask for a raise of hands on this. It says, how much would it cost to mobilize the resources to arrest, detain, legally process, and deport 1 million immigrants each year? Is it A, 10 million? Anybody think that's $10 million? Would it cost $88 billion? B. So, what about C, $120 billion? Now, this is annual.
In between C and D.
Right. And what about D, $1 trillion? So the answer is actually B, $88 billion each year. In a 10-year period, it'll reach about $1 trillion.
And it says legally processed, which
Legal process.
we know won't.
Like new courts.
Yeah.
Now those courts are backed up as it is.
Warehoused until they could get to them.
Right.
Yeah.
And to arrest them and deport them. And that also includes agreements with countries like Honduras to say, will you take these, like your citizens back? And Honduras at the moment, the president down there has indicated that she'll shut down our U.S. base down there in response to this. And that was this week too. So you have, it's a two-way street. You have to get it with the country that you're trying to import to. $88 billion is a lot of money.
So what happens if they say no? I think I've asked you this before.
Then they get stuck in those deportations.
That they just stay.
So indefinitely in prison for what?
Yes.
For
There was something in the news just this week that, I don't know, was it ICE? ICE currently has 34,000 beds at various relocation, deportation centers. And they estimate that if this thing goes through, they're going to need 100,000 beds.
right.
So here's Governor Abbott in Texas.
Right. And he's working with
plans that they're going to have so much money putting in, but where is this money coming from?
Right. It comes from the taxpayers. And that's where, and so that's why you have what the Doge looking at, at ways of cutting costs.
And not
so
to
they can fund this mass deportation.
and not to mention the effect on the agricultural.
Yeah.
You know, it's not going to lower grocery prices. I'll tell you that much.
Oh yeah.
Do you think Trump will try to circumvent the courts and just have a fast track deportation somehow?
At this point, I wouldn't put it past him. And he's got a very favorable Supreme Court at the moment that would probably rubber stamp a lot of what he's trying to do. Since he stacked the court under Mitch McConnell, primarily with the Senate there, who made sure that he was able to put even more of Trump's appointees in power.
Yeah, the Fifth Circuit in Texas. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm just wondering, I'm thinking about diabolical thing, these people who are stuck in these camps, would they be required or encouraged to work? I mean, could you take a concentration camp and have people working as well?
I don't know.
They work for
So
the Germans.
if you think about it with the Japanese and when you're in Japanese Americans in World War II, we placed them in internment camps. But people remember may have watched Star Trek and the actor that played Sulu was one of those people that grew that was a child at the time in those internment camps. It leaves a scar. It damages them psychologically, and harms them because when they actually were allowed to get back to their homes, there were no homes to go back to. No, people had taken advantage of the situation.
I was thinking now that maybe they would be near the camp, they would have places. I mean, because they're going to need workers. So
Right.
they use the workers who were stuck in the camp.
As an answer. I mean, that's what they did with if you look back at a lot of fascist countries that had internment camps, things like that. And I'm not talking just about Germany and Italy, but also at one point under Batiste down in Cuba, they were doing things like that when they were forcing them to work. It's possible. And the thing is, it does have a huge impact on the economy, on the economy that you're in when it comes to immigrants in the United States. I have New Americans in Ohio, which is the American Immigration Council, has a status that there's about 581,000 immigrant residents in Ohio, just in our state alone. And then of that, $8.6 billion is the immigrant spending power here in this state. If we started deporting them, it not only impacts those individuals, but the communities that they represent, because some of them have family members that are U.S. citizens. Do we break them up? And tear those families apart? Do we break up those communities? The Haitian community that was so maligned against down in Springfield, Ohio here, they are here under temporary protected status. They were escaping. Many of them left during the time of the earthquake and such that had taken place in Haiti and subsequent collapse of their country. Now we overrun with gangs down there, and they really don't have any place to go. And yet you have down in Springfield, we had a declining population before they came, and you have businesses and companies down there that were just in dire need of employees, and so they reached out to different communities, including the Haitian community, and brought them in. And that community has since helped reinvigorate Springfield, Ohio. And yet they were maligned, and then these nasty stereotypes about eating cats and dogs, for example, came out. That's reminiscent of what's done with Title 42, with the disease, saying disease ridden and such. It plays on our fears and our bias and the hate that sometimes that communities can develop because we start to develop hate when we think that these are horrible people. And that's basically, as it brings us up and rolls us into the discussion here about this, and how does this affect secular humanism? Or I forget that this one. The 10 Commitments is a very important document that the American Humanist Association put out. It got secular humanists really to try to follow a lot of these. And what I wanted to point out specifically for altruism, empathy, global awareness, peace, and social justice. These are important values that we'd like to uphold as secular humanists. Altruism is the selfless concern for the welfare of other living beings. And then empathy is to consider other people's thoughts, feelings, and experiences. Empathy promotes tolerance, consideration, and compassion amongst us all. Local awareness, we recognize that we're part of a larger world community. It's not just what happens here, it's how we impact the other countries. And believe it or not, the United States has a strong soft power, which means that we have the other countries see our culture, and they look without many of the values that we promote through our music, through our books and such. And so they look to this place as a place of freedom as well, which brings us back to that full concept of what Statue of Liberty represents. And then peace and social justice is a commitment to social justice and affirm the human rights and personal autonomy of all people. And under the first administration, Trump administration, during the Family Separations Act, the Humanist statement came out on separating families at the U.S. border, and as well as a resolution of global community and international affairs, which stated that throughout this pale blue dot, as billions of people move through their daily lives, there exists a universal aspiration for a better life. It is what draws individuals to become participating members of society, and it is what causes the continual improvement of societies. The challenges that our world faces now call for humanity to move beyond the in-group concerns of individual societies and work toward creating global united responses. And a lot of the problems that we have with immigration today it's us how we meddle with the other countries' affairs over time. The banana wars in the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s resulted in a lot of displaced of governments that were collapsing and instability in those regions, which we're still seeing those impacts today as those people, many of them trying to flee countries that are run by totalitarian governments and seeking a refuge in a country that helped promote that to begin with, partly because of the fact that we were fighting in some ways to support our business life down. That's why I call it banana wars. We have the American Fruit Company was down there in Honduras and in Guatemala and places like that. And they started to nationalize much of property because about 90% of the land was under these corporations. And those governments wanted to kind of level it out again and make it a more equitable living space for all the people. And our national government at the time sent troops in and destabilized those countries and supposed dictators. We're still seeing those repercussions to this day. And the same thing happened in Iran. We talked about the Iran, how their hatred is for the United States. We helped put a dictator in charge of the country because we wanted the oil at that. And in fact, it became our worst nightmares as an adversary, as a nation. And those things are still impacting us today. Social justice is very important. Humanists are nationally committed to social justice as a prerequisite to peace and happiness for the greatest number, and see it as a moral failing to stand by while others neither civil and human rights. And with the immigration laws that we have in place, and the tighter the restrictions, the more this is abhorrent to us as humanists, as secular humanists. And to give a face to people with contributed in the United States, these were all immigrants to the United States, including Isaac Asimov, up in the upper left-hand side. He was a Russian. His family came from Russia during the Soviets were starting to come into being. And so it was a Russian Soviet Federalist Socialist Republic, and came to the U.S., became a prolific science fiction writer, popular, and a secular humanist myself, an atheist. Carlos Santana is a Mexican-American who came from Mexico and has become, he's well known for his music. I'm not going to go through them all, but I wanted to point out a few. Salman Rushdie has a fatwa against him because of his writings and such. I wanted to point out Dr. Bennett Oliver, who is the gentleman right here because of him, he came from Nigeria. Was it Nigeria? Let me see. Yeah, Nigerian American physician, forensic pathologist. He discovered chronic traumatic encephalopathy. This is the brain trauma that a lot of football players that has become more understood now today. And it's because he came to the United States and was researching that, that we are actually trying to treat people of that type of brain damage. That includes a lot of service members who had served in Afghanistan and Iraq. Our body armor protects that, but it doesn't protect their brains. And so they're coming back with different types of, with unusual types of brain damage, among other things. And here is an immigrant who is making America a better place. And that's also true with even, I would say, there's Ilan Omar. She's a Somali American who she escaped Somalia with her family when she was very young. She'll never be able to become a U.S. president because she wasn't born in the United States, but she can serve this country, and she has picked up that service model to represent her people in her constituency and the United States, and making better laws for all of us and making better place for all of us. And as much as people vilify her right now, she really is trying to do fun for all Americans. So that was basically the last slide there. I have beyond that, just some more references and such that I'm happy to give out if anybody needs. And what you may not have seen some of the earlier slides and such. And I definitely recommend that podcast that I mentioned earlier, which is the Throughline, NPR Throughline there. They're talking more specifically about asylum, the asylum process here in the United States. And they give some really interesting discussions on that as well. So that's it. Yes.
I've often been curious about the requirement for naturalization that people learn English, given the fact that the United States has never declared that to be an official language. So how do they
justify it?
how do they justify that?
Well, that's actually, I mean, honestly, it's an unspoken thing that we're all proud that we want everybody in the United States to have English as that primary language there. And so we kind of forced it on anybody that's trying to, and it's part of because of economic reasons. It's just cheaper that everybody using the same language. Now, interesting enough, back in the early 1900s, Ohio, there was in more in the Amish area, there were a lot of people that spoke German from Amish time. That was the only language. They didn't speak English. Up in Minnesota, you had people that were Swedish descent and such, speaking that particular language. In the Southwest, you have a lot of places there where they're still speaking Spanish primarily because it's just easier. It's part of their cultural roots. And in places like California, you have strong communities that speak Chinese and such as well. So we definitely are integrating a lot of these different languages and things into this country. And I think it enriches our culture and makes us a better people overall. It strengthens us as a country. In the South, you have Gullah, which is a type of Creole from a pidgin language is what they would consider, that is representative of some places over in West Africa and such, that is kind of intermixed. And in Louisiana, you have Cajun. So that's a corrupted version of pidgin language of French that they speak down there. So these things all change. And in fact, in the Southwest, I speak very good Spanish. So, and there's that's kind of a bit of a pidgin language between English and Spanish because that culture is kind of blending. So these things change over time. English is very malleable because we have we use language from all these different places. If we had English as an official language, we have to replace the names of states like Colorado, for example, or which is a Spanish name, or Utah, which is actually it's a Native American name. So I mean, it gets kind of funny if we're trying to make those kinds of changes here, and it's important to know that we are. I think this is really it talks back to the strengths of this country if we accept all these different cultures and kind of assimilate them under one nation. Any other questions? I'm not, like I said, I'm not an attorney. So I can't, definitely not that.
But you play one on TV.
Passionate around,
Very much. Speaking ticket.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Derek. Very, very interesting.